The content you're about to hear may be graphic in nature. Listener discretion is advised. This is True Crime XS.
We're now officially into double digits of like the holiday stories where we've told so many in such a short period of time. And the last couple like have had some variation to them. This one I put together largely from newspapers.com. There's not a lot about this in terms of the exoneration itself, but St. Joseph News, the Parsons Sun, the Kansas City Times, the St. Joseph Gazette, I think is the name of one of the papers there. They put a lot of this into newspapers.com. You can find this in a couple of different wiki articles kind of all put together. I thought this was a really interesting story. The distinction of this one is that one of the people involved had the longest prison tenure for being a wrongfully convicted American woman. I thought that was interesting. There are multiple trials. The Innocence Project has been involved in this one. So they have some stuff on their website that you can go in and read a little bit about there. There's a lot of paper in terms of court documents. It falls into stuff that spills all the way into 2024. So like this year, some of this stuff has been in the court. So we don't know the ultimate outcome, like for compensation and stuff on this one. But I thought, it's the holidays. This is a case that's about 43 years old. It happened in November of 1980. It's a very interesting murder case. And when I looked at it, there is like a brief tie to another case out of the same area. So I thought that we would take a crack at including it, even though it's kind of recent in some of the activity that's gone on here. This is a story of the November 12th, 1980 murder of a woman named Patricia Jeske. And this happens in St. Joseph, Missouri. Had you ever heard of this before?
No, I hadn't.
So the way that this story starts is Patricia Jeske is 31 years old, and she does not show up for her job at the desk at the St. Joseph, Missouri Library. The library director is a woman named Dorothy Elliott, and she goes through all the motions of what you do when one of your employees doesn't show up. She tries to call her, but she gets to a point where she's very concerned about Patricia. So she goes to her house. She's not able to get into her house. Her house is locked up. But Patricia's mother is her emergency contact. It's a woman named Helen McLaughlin. So Dorothy calls Helen. And Helen comes over to the house and tries to figure out how to get into the house. She can't, so she breaks the back window and enters the house. And she discovers that Patricia is dead inside. She has a telephone cord around her neck, and she has a laceration to the back of her head. When they're doing this, it's actually November 13th, 1980. There's no signs of forced entry on her home, according to the police chief, who at the time was a man named James Robert Hayes. But again, this is 43 years ago. The last time anyone had seen Patricia alive was around 5 p.m. on November the 12th, so the day before. She was naked. She had a laceration to the back of her head. And in addition to the telephone cord around her neck, there were signs that she had been sexually assaulted. She was ultimately determined to have died from a mixture of strangulation and blunt force trauma to her head. The medical examiner said she'd probably been dead for somewhere between 12 and 16 hours before her body was discovered at 1 p.m. the following day. Now, a man named Lloyd Paisley is put in charge of the investigation for the St. Joseph Police. And her parents put up a $1,000 reward. A journalist mistakenly publishes a blurb stating that a 24-year-old man had been charged with Patricia's murder after overhearing parts of a conversation between a captain and a lieutenant at the local police. For the local police's part, they said they investigated over 200 leads. A lot of the articles that you will read about this start off with the words, "Police have no suspects in slaying." Now, the case is covered by the local media really heavily because it was considered to be a pretty shocking crime. As far as the investigation goes, on December the 5th, the police arrest a woman named Sandra Lynn Hemme and a man named Joseph Patrick Wapski. Wapski gets charged with murder, and Sandra Hemme gets charged with a Class D felony of concealing knowledge of a crime. She's also charged with a Class D felony assault for attempting to use a knife against a police officer in an unrelated case that took place around Thanksgiving, so after Patricia's murder. Hemme had been a patient at the St. Joseph State Hospital, and for her part, she stated that she had just been bumming around the area. Her parents actually lived in Concordia, Missouri. Now, when she was 13 years old, Sandra Hemme first attempted suicide. She had been hospitalized in various mental institutions over the next 8 years for approximately 6 of those years. And that was in Kansas City, St. Louis, Jefferson City, and Columbia. And she had also been hospitalized in Maryland at one point. According to all accounts, she had attempted suicide multiple times. Sandra Hemme is the one who identifies Joseph Wapski as the killer of Patricia Jeske. For Wapski's part, he says that he doesn't know who Sandra Hemme is. Her initial story to the detectives that were investigating Patricia's murder, they weren't about murder at all. They were actually about her having gone hitchhiking with 2 people named Joe and Pat. She later changes her story, and the next day she includes the man's full name as Joe Wapski. She says they went to a house with Pat, and that Pat came out with blood on his hands, stating, quote, "I killed that fucking bitch," after talking about, and this is another quote, human and animal sacrifices. And according to Hemme's story, Pat had threatened to kill Hemme if she told anybody. So Hemme, for her part, was able to lead police to Patricia's house. But if you listen to what the lawyers say in the various court documents affiliated with this case, they state that the police just drove her straight there. Later on, Sandra Hemme would say that she witnessed the murder and she attempted to stop Joe Wapski from killing Patricia Jeske. Police showed Sandra Hemme pictures of the crime scene. Switching over to Joseph Wapski for a second, he had been in prison multiple times since 1958. He had an assault on 2 police officers in September of 1977. And at the time this all happened, he had been living at a halfway house. So a halfway house is a place that people who have criminal backgrounds, I know in some areas they can be referred to as rehabilitation places. But here, this is a place for someone who is coming out of prison to go onto parole or to be in some other type of supervised situation before they're just released back into society. Multiple witnesses and receipts and some business records in Topeka, Kansas confirmed that Joseph Wapski couldn't have been anywhere near the murder of Patricia Jeske. He gets his charges dropped. And at one point, it was rumored that Wapski was suing the police for damages due to the false accusations of murder. From what I can tell, that's just something that appears in a blurb when an ambitious newspaper reporter was looking for a sort of a soundbite or a quote. But Hemme ends up being charged with Patricia's murder on December the 10th, and she is denied bail. Now, for her part, the assault charge where she tried to take a knife to a police officer is dropped. So at this point, she is just facing charges for the murder of Patricia Jeske. She's initially scheduled to appear in court on December the 18th, but a grand jury convenes prior to this. And on December the 15th, she's indicted. This results in her being arraigned directly into the Circuit Court Division 3 instead. Now, because this happens, and she has no preliminary hearing here, this results in evidence not being shown publicly until the trial begins. Her lawyer is a man named Dale Sullivan, and he pretty much immediately requests that the court perform multiple examinations related to Sandra Hemi's mental health and her competency. Initially, Sandra Hemi pleads not guilty. But on April 10th of 1981, she changes her not guilty plea to guilty. The judge, for his part, it's a guy named Fred Schoenlaub, he initially will not accept her guilty plea. He felt like her allocution was too vague and that the defendant did not remember, quote, how she had gotten there, and he ordered that the case go forward to trial. But after some conversation between the attorneys, the judge agrees to accept her guilty plea. And he sentenced her to life in prison without parole for 50 years. Based on her claims to the judge, she said, quote, I had lost control, and that, quote, I was pretty well intoxicated. Now, she claimed that she had met Patricia Jeske at Platt College, and that she said that Patricia had picked her up while she was hitchhiking to Kansas City, and Sandra Hemi asked if she could get a shower at Patricia's house. Hemi says that while this was going on, they got into an argument over money that Patricia owed her due to some drug deal. In the course of her guilty plea, Hemi stated that the prosecution had promised her that if she pled guilty, the prosecutor wouldn't ask for the death penalty. She stated that she had used a hunting knife to kill Patricia before throwing it away at a park in Lexington, Missouri. And she also stated that she had taken Patricia Jeske's purse and she had thrown it away near Interstate 70. So police went and looked for the knife, which would be the purported murder weapon, could have caused some of the injuries to Patricia's head. And they go looking for the purse, and they don't find either item. Now, Jeske's father, Earl, this is Helen's husband, he took issue with the fact that Sandra Hemi claimed that she killed Patricia in a disagreement over some kind of drug deal. In fact, he stated that his daughter neither used nor sold any drugs. Okay, so for this part, we are basically looking at Sandra Hemi going into prison for a long time. What do you think of this in terms of this being a, quote, trial?
I mean, well, to speak to what you just were talking about, I feel like there's a lot of bunk involved in this.
Yes, there's definitely bunk here.
And it's always interesting to me. And I can't really think of examples to give, but it's always interesting to me when when you're adding insult to injury, right? With regard to this story, and then the fact that like she talks about like something to make the victim look even worse, that by accounts of her family, I think you said her father, like she didn't do drugs, right?
Yep.
She didn't sell drugs. She didn't use them. There's no reason why there would have been this altercation happening over some sort of drug transaction or whatever, right?
Yeah.
But it's always interesting that when it's a story to begin with, it's made worse. Now, I don't really know what to make of it. I do feel like things like this go on too long. Right? This one certainly went on too long because it seems to me like somebody could have put a stop to the nonsense, right?
Yeah.
As far as this being a trial, well, there's no question somebody died, right? I wanted to ask you, have you ever seen like the combination thing where they said that she died from a combination of blunt force trauma and asphyxiation?
Yeah, I mean, this is similar to what we talked about with Jay Polhill, where there were injuries on him that could have been strangulation, but he also had severe blunt force trauma. It's very similar to that. I pulled the court records on this because I had the same question you did there. And I did it because, like, she's got this whole hunting knife thing she did. If you look at the court records on Sandra Hemi's case, the most interesting document was this 1984 appellate document. So this is after she's pled guilty. And her attorneys go in and basically say, look, this is crazy. This is from September 4th, 1984, the Missouri Court of Appeals. So this is who would get it right after the circuit court had it. Here's what they put in and how the court rules. It says, this is an appeal from the order of the trial court denying a motion under Rule 27.26 to set aside the movement's conviction and sentence on her plea of guilty to the offense of capital murder. The sentence imposed on the plea was life imprisonment without eligibility for parole for 50 years. The issue is the asserted ineffectiveness of defense counsel in failing to raise issues of the movement's mental state at the time of the offense and her competence to enter this plea. The appellant was charged with murder of one Patricia Jeske on November 12, 1980 by stabbing and strangling the victim. So right there, stabbing and strangling is different than strangling and blunt force trauma to me. And if you read between the lines in some of this and what's coming up ahead, it looks like she had injuries that could have been either way that caused contusions on her head. No witnesses to the crime are reported. The record of the plea hearing includes no description of the evidence the state would have offered in trial, save only the statements obtained from the movement herself, which is Sandra Hemi here. The file suggests that Sandra Hemi was first interrogated about the crime on December 5th, 1980, and on December 10th, 1980, she confessed to having perpetrated the homicide. Certain facts relative to the movement's medical history and circumstances are not in dispute. Some of the information entered the record for the first time at the hearing on the 27.26 motion, while other details were available at the time the plea of guilty was accepted. The same judge who imposed sentence did not conduct the motion hearing. So counsel who presented the movement on the criminal charge testified at the motion hearing. But at that time, Sandra Hemi had retained another attorney to present this motion. The gist of this claim for the 27.26 motion was that criminal trial counsel had failed to make minimal preparation of the defense and had instead actively promoted the entry of a guilty plea, notwithstanding the movement's lengthy history of mental illness induced by drug abuse. Okay, so this 27.26 hearing that they're talking about here, they're basically saying everybody was in court for Sandra Hemi to plead guilty. Her counsel, the prosecution, and no one was really representing her interests except for herself. And they're saying she was not competent to represent her own interests in this instance. And I actually believe that that is probably the case. Okay, so I have to say that, I don't think Sandra Hemi's interests were being represented here. Not by anybody. Related to this appeal and this document that we have in front of us, the counsel for her has made a mistake in terms of the people standing there with her while she is pleading guilty. Now, they go on to point out that she has a long history of mental illness. They say it's induced by drug abuse, but I don't think that's even relevant. She is 21 years old when she's entering this guilty plea, knowing that she will be in prison until she is 71 years old before she can apply for parole. They say that she was 13 years old when she first attempted suicide, and then she received psychiatric treatment for that in 1972. So the 8 years that follow, which is the time between her being 13 and now, in terms of this plea, she's only 21 years old, but she's been in and out of hospital so much that they characterize it as her having been hospitalized for almost 6 full years out of the 8 years between the time she attempts to commit suicide for the first time and the crime that she's charged for in this case. According to the state's reconstruction of events, Sandra Hemi gets out of the hospital the day of the murder and gets back to the hospital that night. So she had been in the hospital prior to the murder, and at the time of her arrest, she was a patient at St. Joseph State Hospital. The record here does not include all the material from the criminal file in terms of the appeal, and the appeal court notes it. It does appear that the appellate was first charged with the subject offense on or about December the 5th, after which the grand jury returned an indictment. Now, there's a little bit of difference between the version of what I was reading and this document. It says they returned the indictment on December the 23rd. So basically 2 days before Christmas. At that point in time, private counsel was retained for Sandra Hemme by her father. This would have been soon after her arrest and ahead of her indictment. There is no record of when the attorney undertook to represent it because the attorney filed no entry of appearance. He filed no motions. He filed no pleadings. He was selected, according to the appellant's father, because he had known the family for about 10 years, and he had been a representative for the appellant, Sandra Hemme, as a juvenile when she was sent to a Kansas City hospital for psychiatric treatment and therapy before this crime. So basically, Dad has just reached out to a lawyer who's familiar with Sandra Hemme. The guilty plea takes place on April 10th, 1981. Sandra Hemme enters the plea then. In the first segment of the hearing, Sandra Hemme professed not to have a clear recollection of the killing or any of the events from that day. As she described it, the occurrence was not her act, but as though she were a spectator watching from the outside. The responses she gave did not satisfy the court, and the guilty plea was refused. So this is how the judge starts to question things. The appellate court is looking at it, and they say there is no indication in the record of the plea hearing that the trial court was given any information about the appellate's history of institutional treatment or that concern about the appellate's competence was at the root of the initial refusal to accept the plea. I see some stuff in the record that is slightly contradictory to that, but there are multiple judges that have seen her at this point. This is the judge seeing her in April 1981. As the court stated, the testimony offered by Sandra Hemme was simply not sufficient to satisfy all of the elements of the offense of capital murder. The state made no offer to show what its proof would be apart from Sandra Hemme's confession. At this point, the prosecutor interceded and got a recess. This was evidently to assist the appellate in clearing her memory. During the recess, according to appellant's testimony at the motion hearing, the prosecutor and the defense attorney jointly instructed her as to how she should respond to the court's questions to assure acceptance of the plea. After 15 minutes of a recess, the hearing resumes. The appellant described in some detail to the court the killing of Patricia Jeske, which had now been accomplished by the appellant alone. And so she's now saying she was the killer and how she did it. And the plea gets accepted. The defense counsel asked no questions of the appellant and made no statement on her behalf. The court immediately sentenced the appellant to life imprisonment without parole for 50 years. 5 days later, she's transported out to the Department of Corrections to serve her sentence. Just to be clear what's happening here, they're considering this to be a trial, but she gets there. She had a not guilty plea. Her attorney basically says, I'm not ready to go to trial. And the appellant abruptly changes her plea to guilt. She doesn't.
Right, but she was coaxed into what to say.
Right. So
right there, that's a problem. That's something her attorney should not have allowed to happen. And not only did he allow it to happen, he went along with it.
Honestly, the court shouldn't have allowed it to happen either, because he could see it unfolding.
Well, but it was during a recess. Well, you're right. Okay, yeah, I agree. But it was during a recess, right?
That she's coaxed, yes.
A defense, because basically the court said, I'm not accepting this plea. The prosecutor says, okay, can I have a brief recess? During the recess, they reconvene with the defense attorney, the defendant, and the prosecutor, and they are both feeding her the narrative she has to give to the judge in order for the plea to be accepted. Because depending on a judge's position, I mean, they can accept anything that comes before them, I guess. But, in some cases, they want to make sure justice is happening. And that was one of the cases here. Her initial recount of, whatever she said wasn't enough for him to accept the plea. Right.
And I promise it didn't make any sense. I've seen this happen in lesser charges. I've witnessed it happen in court where the court is trying to accept a plea. What I haven't seen is where the defense attorney basically colludes with the prosecution to walk the defendant through their plea, which is pretty clearly being made because the person realizes they're in deep trouble and their attorney doesn't make any efforts to try and
that it's wrong.
Right.
It doesn't serve the interests of justice. To me, okay, so I tried to imagine the circumstances where like that might be okay, and thought about it. And even in a case where like you had somebody that like couldn't maintain the memory for long enough,
Right.
That's where I'm at with it. Like, when would it be okay for your defense attorney to be standing over you with the prosecutor also standing over you, feeding you information? When would that be okay? And the answer is never. It would never be okay.
And so if we're being fair to the court, they do sometimes accept pleas during this type of situation. And you're right. If it's a recess and like they're all talking to her, the court wouldn't necessarily know exactly what was going on. I personally feel like they should recognize the signs depending on how long they've been on the bench. But when you have
it would be her attorney's job to not have this happen.
Well, you're not wrong, but I have a feeling that like you ever seen people turn into a puddle?
Yes.
Okay, so this is a bunch of puddles. So the prosecutor is not a puddle, but the defense attorney turns into a puddle. And what I mean by that is they just don't know what to do, so they sort of shrink, and they don't know how to stand up to the prosecution. But clearly this other puddle, who is his client, she is now terrified and she doesn't want to go through all of this. So she's just going to plead guilty. I've seen people plead guilty for a myriad number of reasons that aren't they're guilty. They don't want to go through the process. It looks like the evidence is strong against them. Like we have
which is exactly why you have a defense attorney.
Right. So we have a bunch of things happening here. The Missouri Court of Appeals is hearing this part of it after a hearing to determine whether or not they were representing their client's interest. That's the 27-26 hearing that we're talking about. And ultimately, this has all resulted in her heading to the Department of Corrections. So she is going to serve her essentially life sentence. Because if you get in at 21 and you can't get parole before you're 71, I don't care what anybody says, that's ultimately a life sentence. So at this motion hearing, the attorney that turned into the puddle, he testifies that he had prepared the case by reviewing the prosecuting attorney's file. He talked to Sandra Hemme. He examined her file from St. Joseph's Hospital. And he had made some investigation as to the other persons that Sandra Hemme had described as being involved. He gave that information to St. Joseph Police Department. He agreed at the time. He was acquainted with her history of hospitalization because that's how he knew her, and that it had gone on for the previous 8 years. He was relatively acquainted with her having been a patient at the time the offense was committed. So he kind of screws up there, but like, I don't think he knew one way or the other what was going on. I don't think he was paying attention. I think he was being a puddle. Now, by the time he's testifying again, he says Sandra Hemme's history and condition did raise a doubt in his mind as to her competency, specifically her competency to proceed with a trial or to proceed with his plea. And he had a doubt as to her mental capacity at the time that the crime was committed. Despite having these two doubts, he doesn't do anything at that time to file a motion for a mental examination. He doesn't give any information to the court in the form of a statement or witnesses to her history of hospitalization or treatment. And he gives no notice of any intention to rely on any type of defense related to what was potentially a mental disease or defect or competency. And as he described it, he wasn't impressed with his defense.
He wasn't. He wasn't impressed. This is the defense attorney?
Yeah, he didn't know what he was doing, and he's admitting to ineffective assistance at this hearing.
Okay. Well, and at that point of where they're at, okay. But here's my question. So is there a question of actual, like, innocence here?
At this point in time, we're just trying to get her back in front of a judge. She has now babbled her way through several confessions. And I say that because they're totally incoherent. I'm not insulting her. She just has no idea what she's doing. You have to remember, you and I talk about this all the time. This is a 21-year-old person who has a history of problems that have required rehabilitation and therapy and hospitalization for those things. So this is not a person who should be making decisions on her own at this point, let alone guilty pleas.
Well, right, but it also would be the very first flag that is raised with regard to, like, oh, you know, what's happening here? I don't know how she, like, I don't know how any of this starts.
It starts by her having a conversation with the police and blaming some people that couldn't possibly have been involved. That should have been the first big red flag that we have no idea what we're doing.
Right, okay.
The point raised in this appeal, which is dispositive of the case, is a claim that the appellant's guilty plea was involuntary because her trial counsel was entertaining some doubt as to her competency to proceed, but then sought no adjudication on the issue, and he did not communicate this in any way to the judge. Where the accused has entered a plea of guilty, adequacy of representation is material only if ineffective representation has affected the voluntariness and understanding of the plea. So the conviction of an accused while legally incompetent is a denial of due process. You can read about this in Missouri law under Hall versus State, or in U.S. law, Pate versus Robinson. A person is not competent to proceed if, because of a mental disease or defect, he lacks the capacity to understand the proceedings against him or to assist in his own defense. That is also Missouri from 1978. That's Bryant versus State. If counsel for the accused comes to an honest belief that his client lacks present capacity for rational understanding and cooperation, he is under a duty to obtain adjudication of the issue because the ongoing criminal conviction process relies on the absence of doubt by defense counsel as to the client's competency. And that's Miller versus State, also Missouri law. So they're reviewing all of this. And in the review of a trial court order denying relief under this 2726 motion, the appellate court is limited to a determination of whether the judgment of the trial court is clearly erroneous. The trial court's findings are clearly erroneous only when the appellate court is left with a firm conviction that a mistake has been committed. The appellate court says, we are concerned in ruling this appeal only with the issue stated, that is, whether the appellate was competent to proceed between the date of the charge and the date of her guilty plea, and whether counsel was ineffective in failing to initiate adjudication of the question. The trial court in its findings declared that appellant was competent to enter her plea, and further construed the testimony of appellant's trial counsel not to be indicative of doubt that appellant was competent when the plea was entered. These findings are clearly erroneous. All of the facts recited earlier in this opinion, including appellant's long history of treatment for mental problems, her repeated attempts at suicide, her then current status as a patient receiving treatment at St. Joseph State Hospital on the date the offense was committed and on the date of her arrest, her confused initial plea testimony, psychologically described as derealization, were all uncontested, and if fully known by the trial court, should have, and no doubt would have prompted, an inquiry to ascertain the appellant's actual mental condition before acceptance of the plea. Added to this is the unequivocal testimony by appellant's trial counsel that he did have doubt, not only as to appellant's mental condition when the crime occurred, but also doubt as to her competency to proceed. There's no latitude on this evidence for any other construction or interpretation. Trial counsel was remiss in failing to request a mental examination of appellant as the initial step of trial preparation, and in failing to make known to the trial court his doubt about appellant's competence and the medical and personal history on which the doubt was based. In these circumstances, appellant was ineffectively served by counsel who stood mute, and the court erred in not so finding. Appellant was not afforded her due process right to effective counsel, and her conviction is therefore fatally flawed. The judgment of conviction is reversed, and the cause is remanded with direction that appellant be allowed to withdraw her plea of guilty. Okay, so that's how we like deal with the first quote trial, which is not a trial. It's just really one hearing after her indictment.
Well, and plus she entered a plea.
Correct.
I mean, a trial is where a judge or a jury finds, right? And that's not what happened. If the judicial system were school, this would have been the appellate court putting a gigantic F on the paper.
Yes. Yeah. So
that's how I was imagining this happening, because it's just like failure after failure after failure. Like, are you even paying attention to what's happening?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, so you would think that like what we just talked about is enough for a trial court to look at this and go, all right, we got to deal with this. It's not what happened.
Well, in a better world, I would, yeah.
So if you go to the wiki page now, and this has been slightly updated recently, I like to get in there and tinker on the Sandbox on Wiki. So this is what it says. It was a disaster. Now it's more of a disaster. I tried to fix it. People want to go back to this. I think it's someone who is not a native English speaker, who is typing up the wiki entry for Patricia's case. And they keep changing everything I edit and fix back. So whatever. Here's what it says. The header on there says second trial. It says Sandra Hemme was questioned about the disappearance of Mickey Jo West the day after pleading guilty. Sandra Hemme claimed that a cult buried the body of Mickey Jo West near St. Joseph. She claimed that Mickey Jo was a member of the cult and that her body was cut open and had her organs removed. No evidence of the crime was ever discovered despite 13 officers searching the area. West's disappearance was later featured on Unsolved Mysteries in 1988. I don't know why they put that in there. It is relevant to this case, and it is right after she pleads guilty.
Well, I don't know, though, because my initial thing is like, okay, so why is this coming up? And like, are you going to explain who Mickey Jo is? Because like,
I'm going to now.
Well, right. But, in that, because, we're talking about the death of Patricia.
Correct. So Mickey Jo West came up in one of the initial confessions. Now, I have not found exactly where it came up, but it has to be mentioned prior to her indictment because there's a date in here saying that sometime, and depending on which version, I believe she was indicted on December 23rd. I believe the grand jury convened on December 16th, although some of the paperwork, and this is court documents, it does say that she was indicted on December 16th. I don't believe that's the case. I believe her arrest had occurred in the weeks prior, but remember, this is a person who was in a state hospital the whole time. It's not like they're running around to find her somewhere and have to bring her in for a real arrest. She's just being arrested in situ. So she's being arrested in process, but for the most part, she's in the hospital, then in the jail, then back to the hospital. Mickey Jo West comes up sometime between December 5th and December the 16th. I don't know who she mentions it to, but it's in one of the 3 recorded confessions that she's alleged to have given that make no other sense either. So the later confessions include mentions of things like the knife and the purse. Those are pretty clearly coached. We don't really get here in terms of public information. I believe it's police officers coaching her. In my mind, I've never gotten past Lloyd Paisley somehow being involved with this. He was the lead investigator on Patricia's case. But let's talk about Mickey Jo for just a second because it's crazy. So in 1979, going all the way back, a young girl named Ruth West, her brother Calvin West, and Calvin's wife, 19-year-old Mickey Jo West, they leave the area of St. Joseph, Missouri, and they head out to California. A man named Marvin Irvin allegedly goes with them. Ruth West and Marvin Irwin get married in Ventura, California. They do not have a happy marriage. They return to St. Joseph, Missouri area at some point in the near future, and their relationship had degraded. In August of 1979, Ruth takes her kid and they leave. This guy, Marvin Irwin. They go to a motel in Elwood, Kansas. Now, she only tells her mom, her sister, and the couple who had helped her move there, and Mickey Jo West. That's her brother's wife, her sister-in-law. On September 11th, Mickey Jo is supposed to show up at her job at her hospital, but she never arrives. That same day, this weird guy, Marvin Irvin, and 2 of his friends, they break into this motel in Elwood, Kansas, and they drag Ruth West and their son into a car. They drive them back to St. Joseph, Missouri. Mickey Jo is never seen again. The suspect in Mickey Jo's case has always been Marvin Irvin. Later that year, Ruth West files to divorce him because the St. Joseph's police keep polygraphing Marvin Irvin, and he doesn't pass. He doesn't exactly fail, but everything they ask him about Mickey Jo is inconclusive. They have another domestic dispute between them, and Marvin Irvin is arrested chasing Ruth West across St. Joseph, Missouri, after she has run out of her house semi-clothed and barefoot. On September 11, 1986, 7 years since Mickey Jo has gone missing to the day, an anonymous letter is found inside a Kansas City shopping mall. The letter is addressed to the St. Joseph Police, and it contains details about the writer being a person who was with Marvin Irvin at the time of Mickey Jo West's disappearance. The writer claims that Marvin killed her. But the writer didn't leave details about who he or she was, and police were not able to follow up on an exact lead. In 1988, 2 years later, a television reporter named Thurman Mitchell received a letter addressed to him. The letter contained details about where Mickey Jo West's body could be found, the writer inviting Mitchell to show him where Mickey's body was. Instead of meeting up with this sender, Thurman Mitchell does a news story on the letter, and he asks for the sender to come forward. That same year, Marvin Irvin and another woman had moved to Ames, Iowa, and Marvin was working as a railroad worker. On March 30th, Janet Hugrich filed a police report because Marvin Irvin had shot over her head, like in the air, multiple times. The resulting police confrontation between the Ames, Iowa police and Marvin Irvin ended with a police chase across multiple counties, 20 officers in pursuit, and they end up arresting him. Marvin Irvin pled guilty to those offenses, which were basically fleeing and eluding, and a couple of weapons charges, and he gets 5 years probation. While he's in jail awaiting charges for something else, Marvin Irvin denied killing anyone. His brother openly believed that officials were setting up Marvin and that they wanted him for some cases. So they were determined to try and get him for this. He is also involved in another case of disappearance of two young women, Patricia Rose and Crystal Simmons. So by all counts, he is a murderer. Detectives learn that not only is a suspect in the Patricia Rose and Crystal Simmons disappearance in 1990, he's also a suspect in the disappearance of Mickey Jo West. They use this to build up a case. Now, over time, Marvin changes his mind and he just pleads guilty to all of it. He does tell authorities that Mickey Jo West's body can be located. And during his sentencing, he said that in 1979, he took Mickey Jo West to a cornfield in Kansas. He killed her there and he buried her body. And this is close to the motel where he tortured her for the information of where Ruth was, killed her and buried her body. He gets sentenced to life in prison. Eventually, he pleads guilty to a couple of different counts. He leads investigators to this farm in Kansas where he said he disposed of Mickey Jo West in October of 1991. Authorities bring out search dogs and a bulldozer. There's heavy rainfall. The search gets delayed. They do this again on October the 11th. The search team still isn't able to find her body. As of right now, Mickey Jo West's body has never been found. I'm giving you that background because for some reason, Sandra Hemi makes up this crazy confession of knowing about this cult who Mickey Jo West is allegedly a part of. And it makes about as much sense as me including it here. But it's part of her case. In November of 1982, that's what leads us to this appellate document I was just pulling from. Sandra Hemi recants her confession. She wants to have her guilty plea withdrawn and her sentence vacated. Her attorneys come up with this claim that she waived her constitutional rights without understanding them and that her previous counsel was ineffective. The more she talks, the more crazy she sounds. But the attorneys use that to their advantage. And they say that Sandra Hemi should have had a mental evaluation no matter what was going on. So she gets a second trial. Even though this motion is rejected, the Missouri Court of Appeals, they rule what I just read to you. And they decide that she has to go before a judge and the trial court has to take all of this seriously. So she officially goes on trial in 1985. And she gets found guilty a second time. The trial was a day long. The only evidence presented was Sandra Hemi's confession from years earlier. The prosecution altered Hemi's motive from a financial dispute to being dangerous and having an uncontrollable urge to harm people, effectively negating the defense's strategy of presenting her as incompetent. 3 weeks later, Sandra Hemi, new attorneys file an appellate motion, and they file a motion for a new trial, and it's denied. At some point in time in here, and I don't have exact dates, there is an FBI connection to all of this because they examine the crime scene. They eliminate any physical connection between Sandra Hemi and the murder scene of Patricia Jansky, who we were talking about in the first place. The reason I say at some point in time is because in January of 2024, the defense comes back and asks for an evidentiary hearing based on Brady violations by the St. Joseph Police not revealing they had brought the FBI in on this case. That was a huge deal for me. Bringing them in was pretty important. Now, you don't know anything about these cases, right? I'll go a little more in detail if that's the case. I don't want to drag you through much more of this, but I want to talk about her, and then I'll tell you kind of what happened. Which would you like to hear first?
I don't even know what you're asking me at this point. I'm so confused.
Okay.
So whatever you feel like is, whatever you want to do is fine.
Why are you so confused? Where can I help?
I cannot figure out
How she's convicted?
I would love to know who killed Patricia.
Okay. So they hold a hearing January 2024. And during this hearing, Steve Weston, who's a former detective, he states that he had to stop the police interviews with Sandra Hemi or there would have been more confessions. But he realized that she didn't seem to be totally coherent. And when he's further pressed on that, he says, not only was she not totally coherent, I didn't understand anything she was saying.
Oh, wait, that's what my problem is.
So,
like, none of it makes any sense, right?
right. So June 14th, 2024, a judge named Ryan Horseman, he issues a 118-page memorandum, and he states that the evidence that directly tied another person to this crime was more important than Sandra Hemi's involvement at all.
I would say that the person who they could have literally scheduled her mental evaluation when the crime was happening because she was already at the facility. I would say that that person's confession would be less to be considered than the physical evidence.
Yes. And like
Except they took it and ran with it because she's confessing. They could have said anything to her and she would have confessed to it with a grand story.
Yeah. And she would tell you how it was related to every other criminal case you've ever heard of if you just mentioned the name.
Right. But so right there, that's where I start not believing like how it could possibly have continued. Right.
Yes.
Except it did.
So this massive document is written up, and Ryan Horseman says Sandra Hemi's trial counsel was ineffective. The prosecutors in Buchanan County in Missouri, they were given 30 days to either give her a retrial or dismiss these charges and send her home. They opted to send her home. Sandra Hemi was now a grandmother. On July 19, 2024, at 5:50 p.m., she was released from Chillicothe Correctional Center. She's going to go live with her sister, and her lawyer now says that she's going to need help because due to her long prison tenure of 43 years, she will be ineligible for Social Security. All right, so one of the things that comes out in this memo is during the original arrest, indictment, and prosecution of Sandra Hemi, Dale Sullivan, the lawyer who was standing there in his puddle, he was informed by two journalists from two different newspapers, the St. Joseph Gazette and the St. Joseph News Press, which I mentioned were sources for this, that they believed that the police were covering up one of their officers hiding evidence from the defense in this case. He had been given the name of a possible suspect who was affiliated with the St. Joseph Police Department. One of the reporters told him that the man had been seen in the vicinity of Patricia Jansky's house and had later used Patricia's credit cards to purchase a camera in Kansas City, Missouri, the day after her body had been discovered. Pubic hair samples were taken from Patricia Jeschke's body and the man who used the credit cards. Michael Insko was the prosecuting attorney for Buchanan County, Missouri, and he stated, "We do not expect to file any charges against anyone else in the Patricia Jeschke case." Police denied this. They denied having anything to do with covering anything up. They stated that the FBI had never been involved in this, and the man who took the credit card had taken it from Patricia's purse after finding it near a cabin that he rented. However, an FBI report did exist, and Dale Sullivan ends up seeking out a copy of it. But the allegations of what he was told by these reporters from these two different newspapers and the actual FBI report, according to Dale Sullivan, quote, varied substantially. A police officer named Michael Holman, he gets brought up briefly during the 1985 trial. A week after Patricia Jeschke's murder, Michael Holman quit his job as an officer for the St. Joseph's Police Department. He attempted to purchase $630 worth of photography equipment. Hairs from Holman and Patricia Jeschke's bed sheets had similar microscopic characteristics. Now, according to Michael Holman, he claimed he had had sex with a woman named Mary in a motel near Patricia's house, and that he found a purse with the credit card while walking back to his truck. He altered the name on the credit card from Patricia to Patrick. The woman, Mary, could not be contacted to verify his alibi, and Holman refused to draw a diagram of the motel room's interior. His alibi was never proven, and the motel manager did not remember someone named Mary ever staying there during this period of time. Now, Michael Holman later gets arrested. He's incarcerated in Missouri. He's shipped off to Nebraska. He died in 2015. The hair in Patricia Jeschke's bed sheets was later determined to have been from a black man named Vernon Burris. He was the only black police officer who came to the crime scene. What was in the FBI report was that St. Joseph had asked them to compare Vernon Burris's hair, the hair from Patricia Jeschke's scene. It didn't match. This is the first case I've ever truly gotten to the end of and thought, I have no idea what happened.
Well, that makes two of us, bud. Because to me, I start putting it together a little bit, and then I get, that something else comes up. And then, no, that's not it. That doesn't make sense, right?
Yep.
It almost seems like police did this. Then they used this. I never understood how they explained away the sexual assault.
I've seen it written up in the court documents in a couple different places where they changed it to molestation. And I thought they may have been tinkering there. There was an assistant prosecutor named Pat Robb. He was very good with semantics. And in my opinion, he's the reason that Holman was still out wandering around. So.
Well, we know, okay, with the rare exception, for one thing, now they, I don't know what the explanation was, but we know that with a rare exception, a female is not going to strangle another female to death.
Generally speaking, yes.
That's going to be very difficult in those types of situations, unless, like I said, there's exceptions to be had, but it's going to be rare no matter what. But the strength it takes to strangle another person is typically going to be a male strangling a female.
Right.
Okay. Or you could also say, I guess a child could be strangled as well by either.
Right.
But anyway, there's nothing about the motivation here that makes any sense, that they initially are talking to Sandra Hem, right? Nothing about Patricia's murder scene makes it seem like you should be looking for a woman that is in a mental institute.
Correct.
It clearly is a crime of sexual violence that ended in her death. That's a very common sort of a non-motive motive, right?
Yeah.
Whatever happened. There's no signs of forced entry, which makes it kind of a dud investigation from the very beginning. Now, you do have a police officer, I believe much later, saying like, yeah, when she was talking, I didn't understand what she was saying. I quit interviewing her because I really couldn't understand what she was getting at. I'm not sure exactly where that happened in that span of time.
It was in the 2024 hearing.
Okay, so way later. And, with the memory of it, no less. But don't you see like all kinds of just blatant failures here? I feel like a friend of mine was like, hey, my kid is in trouble. I need your help. The very first thing I would do looking at this case is I would say, well, clearly this is not a woman that has committed this crime with regard to Patricia's murder.
I don't think it's a woman. I never thought that. In everything that I was reading about it, I never got the impression this must be a woman or this could be a woman.
Right. And so right from the jump, you're going, okay, so we've got a female, no forced entry. She's strangled and sexually assaulted, sexually molested. However you want to cut that, it is going to be exceptionally rare for a woman to even stage something like that on another woman.
Yeah.
Okay. Exceptionally rare. And so while this could possibly, there's always an exception, but I will say that more than likely, either the mental instability of a possible perpetrator would either seal the deal there or completely make it impossible. Because if you're talking about a sexual assault between females, it has to have some sort of other element. Females don't have penises, okay?
Yeah, I didn't get to the bottom of like how they got around that. The closest I got, I pulled one article that I felt like the St. Joseph Gazette was onto something with. This is from June 7th of 1985. It's from a guy named Terry Raffensperger, who, if you look this up, he's the courthouse reporter at the time. My guess is he probably talked to these attorneys and gave them a heads up about this. This little clipping says ex-officer had mysterious role in Hemme case. The trial and capital murder conviction this week of Sandra Hemme for the killing of Patricia Jeske brought out information about the brutal killing that had never been disclosed in the 4.5 years since it occurred. But the evidence presented in the trial did little to clear up unanswered questions about the suggested involvement of a former police officer who became a key figure in defense attorney Robert Duncan's closing argument to the jury. Duncan argued while there was no physical or trace evidence to tie Hemme to the crime scene at Jeske's home on Riverside Road, a black hair found on the victim's bedsheets could not be ruled out as having come from Michael Holman. A fragment of a negroid hair, too small to compare, was also found. Holman, then 22, is a black man who had been on the police department for 18 months. The day Jeske's body was found, November 13th, Holman was caught using the dead woman's credit card in a Kansas City, Kansas photography store. During the trial, the jury was not told that Holman was a police officer, nor how he came to have that credit card. After the trial, Assistant Prosecutor Pat Robb was able to clear up a few of the lingering questions about Holman, who is now in the Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City. According to Pat Robb, Holman told investigators that he found Jeske's discarded purse in a ditch along Riverside Road the evening of November the 12th, the night she was murdered. He admitted taking the master charge card, and he tried to buy $630 worth of camera equipment with it. Hemme told police she threw Jeske's purse away near where 6th Street in downtown Kansas crosses over Interstate Highway 70. Robb said that Michael Holman had an alibi for November the 12th and that he could account for his time. But Robb said Holman was alone and no one else could verify it. Less than a week after the murder, Holman was arrested by St. Joseph police and charged with theft by deceit. He had collected theft insurance on a truck which was not stolen. He was then fired from his job. 4 days later, Holman was arrested again, this time on a state warrant charging him with receiving stolen property. Police, using 2 search warrants, recovered a stolen rifle, camera, and a box of jewelry. Those items reportedly were taken from a home. On April 7th of 1981, in an interview with then Detective Lieutenant John Muenbacher, Hemme first talked about Holman being involved with her in the murder of Jeske. Robb said she never mentioned Holman until it was reported in the local news media, and in February that Holman had used Jeske's credit card. So basically an article came out in February that he had been involved in that part. But Pat Robb said that investigators then took photographs of 6 black men to Hemi and asked her to identify Holman. She picked out 3 of the photos as possibly being him. None of the 3 was Holman. In March of 1981, a month before Hemi named Holman as the killer, he was arraigned on 2 grand jury indictments for receiving stolen property and stealing by deceit, the 2 crimes he had already been charged for. In June of 1981, he pleaded guilty and he was sent to prison for 2 years. Out of prison a year later, in June of 1982, he was convicted of stealing and forgery, according to Pat Robb. In 1982, he was also charged with breaking into a residence on Shamrock Lane. On parole in 1984, he was convicted of stealing, this time in Nebraska, and he did prison time there. After he got out of prison, he was returned to St. Joseph, his probation was revoked, and he was sent to prison in Jefferson City. That sounds a lot more like the suspect you should be looking at for the death of Patricia Jeske. They have these hairs.
Yeah, I agree.
Allegedly, the FBI had looked at them. I think today they could probably do more testing on them. Sandra Hemi is going to be home for the holidays. One of the first ones that's like a 2024 home for the holidays. And I apologize for this all being so confusing. I tried to put it together in the best way possible. But the truth is, the prosecution in this case was just all over the place.
It really was, and it's really sad. It's actually it's a very sad injustice.
I've looked it up recently to see like how this was going to go down. Like I want to see who are they going to hang this on, and they pretend like it's definitely Sandra Hemi, and they just couldn't re-prosecute her because of the Brady violations. But
she didn't commit this crime.
She's been 43 years in prison for a crime that, like, in my opinion, she was never capable of committing in the first place.
Special consideration was given to True Crime Excess by LabrottieCreations.com. If you have a moment in your favorite app, please go on and give us a review or a 5-star rating. It helps us get noticed in the crowd. This is True Crime XS.
Twinkles under starry skies, and Kris Kringle's drinking cherry wine. How I wish you were here to stop my Christmas tears. Presents wrapped underneath the tree, hung the stockings up 1, 2, 3. If it could only be
Access is brought to you by John and Meg. It's written, produced, edited, and posted by John and Meg. You can always support True Crime Access through patreon.com, or if you have a story you'd like them to cover, you can reach them at truecrimeaccess.com. Thank you for joining us.
This is just a reminder that we are part of the Zencastr Creator Network, and I put a link in the show notes if you guys want to check it out for your own podcasting needs. I've always enjoyed using Zencastr. Their quality is great, and we were able to join their Creator Network at kind of a key time in their history. I have enjoyed it. I've considered a lot of other places to record and a lot of other ways to put together and host and distribute our podcast. But I've stuck with Zencastr the longest. We've been with them for hundreds of episodes now. And I'm putting a link in the show notes where you can check out what they have to offer and see if it's something you would want to use.